Welcome to Everyday Martial Artist, a weekly podcast where you'll join me, Brian Doucette, as I interview a different martial artist each episode and hear their story. Some guests you may have heard of, and some you probably haven't. Be sure to subscribe where all your favorite podcasts are available. Also visit our website at everydaymartialartist.com. If you're listening for a specific interview, I sure hope you'll stay and check out the other episodes. A very special thank you to Topher Williams for our custom theme music. And now, the newest episode of Everyday Martial Artist. Everyday Martial Artist is brought to you by KOOnline.com for all your martial arts needs. Sparring and safety gear, rank belts, uniforms, weapons, patches, and more. Wholesale supplies made by martial artists for martial artists. Visit us today at ko-online.com. You know, one question I ask every guest on Everyday Martial Artist is about their favorite martial arts book. And there's never been one quite like Martial Theory by Steve Perlman, described as the art of war for the martial arts. Martial Theory helps any martial artist or instructor take their understanding and teaching to the next level. And at martialtheoryU.com, you'll find a global community with instructor groups, Q&A with Steve, live events, and demonstrations to help you apply martial theory directly to your training. It's not just a book, it's a movement. Find Martial Theory on Amazon, and when you join martialtheoryU.com, use discount code EverydayMA for 20% off. That's under $20 a month for life. That's martialtheoryU.com, code EverydayMA. Hello and welcome to Everyday Martial Artist. I'm your host, Brian Doucette, and as we do every week, we're joined by a brand new guest talking about their life and their journey throughout the world of martial arts and other stuff they're involved in. My guest today brings a lifetime of world experience in both martial arts and the world of intelligence and combat training. A U.S. Army veteran and former intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency, he also served as a POW MIA investigation team leader in Vietnam and Laos, giving him a rare and deeply grounded perspective on conflict, risk, and survival. A lifelong martial artist, he's widely considered one of the foremost authorities on handgun point shooting and is one of the few instructors to have been personally trained by the legendary Colonel Rex Applegate. His contributions to the martial arts community have earned him a place in Black Belt Magazine's prestigious Hall of Fame. Many will also recognize him as the co-host and subject matter expert of the Best Defense on the Outdoor Channel, where for 11 years he helped bring practical self-defense knowledge to a wide audience. He's the founder and lead instructor of the Martial Blade Concepts and Counterblade Concept Systems, and a prolific author and designer, having developed more than 20 production knives for some of the most respected names in the industry. Please welcome my guest today, Mr. Michael Janich. How are you doing today, Michael?
I'm doing great. How are you, Brian?
Hey, I'm doing good. I truly appreciate your time. I say it to all my guests, and my listeners probably get sick of saying that, but I know how busy people are. I know how crazy life can get. So anytime someone's willing to take a little time out of their life and do this, I truly appreciate it. And I know my listeners do too. So I thank you very much for your time.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I mentioned in the intro, you're a lifelong martial artist, but what I want to know is what led to that? Where did that first interest come from? Where did you first learn about martial arts? Kind of that first spark that kicked off your martial arts journey?
It was kind of two things. One is the area where I grew up. I was literally a half block outside of Chicago, so kind of in a grungy suburb called Cicero.
Okay.
And having self-defense skills was not a bad idea for that area.
Okay.
It's definitely an applicable skill set. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was I grew up during the early 1970s. So kind of the height of the Bruce Lee era was really kind of the start of the martial arts craze. And, it was something that because of its popularity and its growth at that time, something that appealed to me. So those two things kind of went hand in hand.
Okay. What led to that, taking that first step then? Like what age were you in, and kind of how did you find that first school to train at?
So again, this was early 1970s. So I was, probably 10 or 11 years old, was, really interested in studying martial arts. Again, we were kind of in a grungy blue collar area, and there was one martial arts school in town. So persuaded my dad to take us there and see if I could sign up for lessons. And, unfortunately, that school, they did both judo and hard-style Japanese karate, and it was very much kind of the black belt factory type of thing. So first thing they did was whipped out a contract. Here's a 2-year contract. You sign here, and you pay this much, and we guarantee at the end of this time that, I'm going to have a black belt.
Wow.
And it was expensive, and it also kind of soured me immediately just on the idea of, okay, so it doesn't matter how much I know, it's just how much I pay that gets me a black belt. That's not really what I'm interested in. I want to learn this stuff. So my dad took a look at the cost and he's like, hey, we can't afford this. Sorry. So started buying books. Back then it was the Bruce Tegner books. So Bruce Tegner was an expert on everything. So would hit the bookstore, started buying Black Belt magazine, and just doing as much research as I possibly could. And for lack of anything else available, started boxing at the YMCA. So we had a guy who was a former Golden Gloves boxer. He was basically a coach at the local YMCA. So I figured, okay, it's better than nothing. So I boxed for about a year and then was getting ready to go. I was actually in 8th grade, getting ready to go to high school, and saw an article in the local newspaper that the high school that I'd be going to had a martial arts club.
Really?
So reached out to the head of the martial arts club, was a guy by the name of Art Schuett. He was a history teacher at the high school. And I said, hey, I'm really interested and I can't wait until I get to high school because I want to join this club. And he said, well, as a matter of fact, we actually have a commercial school. If you're interested in getting ready or getting started sooner, why don't you come on down, take a look and see if you want to join our school. So it was just a really grungy little storefront dojo, and it was a system called American Self-Protection, ASP, which was a composite martial art founded by a guy named Evan S. Baltazi. And it was basically a combination of judo, aikido, savate, and Western boxing. And basically what would happen was at the end of every month, they'd kind of get together and take a look at the rent, take a look at the utilities, add it all up, divide it by the number of students they had that month, and then figure out what everyone's dues were.
Okay.
Much more affordable than the commercial martial arts school that we had looked at. And I jumped in and I said, so how many classes do I get a week? And it's like, you can train every day if you want to, as long as there's an instructor here. Come on in and learn. Even if there's not an instructor here, if you earn our trust, we'll get you a key and you can still come in and work out and hit the bag and do whatever else you want. So I was training, 6, sometimes 7 days a week, and just threw myself into it. And that was kind of what got me started.
Wow. Well, first of all, I want to back up a little, because when you talked about like that one school, the Black Belt Factory, I mean, I've heard of that happening in like maybe the late 80s, 90s. I never knew that there were schools doing that even back then. You're actually probably the first one I've heard talking about a school like that from back in like the 70s. So that's crazy.
It was one of the first schools where, it was really kind of, it was a nice school. They had, had tatami mats down. Basically the downstairs was more the karate dojo, and then the upstairs was judo. And, it was a very well appointed school.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they had a lot of overhead, but certainly the way that they approached it was very, very commercialized, especially for that time.
Oh yeah. That's crazy. That had to have been rare back then, because like I said, almost 300 guests, and you're the first one that's even mentioned something like that back then. So, because I've run into it myself, in the 80s, 90s, and beyond. But yeah, when you said that, my eyes just kind of like, wow, really?
Yeah, sadly, they were ahead of their time.
yeah, not in a good way, unfortunately. So, okay, and so the ASP school, how long did you end up staying there?
So what was really cool about that school was that all of the instructors who were there, also all the senior guys, had experience with traditional martial arts. Mm-hmm. And they'd also kind of grown frustrated with some of the dogma, some of the politics and everything that kind of plagued those arts. So all of our senior instructors, we had black belts in Aikido, we had black belts in Judo, we had black belts in Kyokushinkai Karate, all different types of stuff. And what was great about it was the core of what we did was the ASP curriculum, which looking back on it now was really nothing special, but it was the best I had at the time. But what I really looked forward to was kind of the final half hour of every session. We usually train for about 2.5 hours. Mm-hmm. And the last half hour or so, one of the instructors would be like, hey, you guys want to see some kicking other than what we do in ASP? Yeah, sure. Okay, I've got a black belt in Taekwondo. Let me show you some cool stuff. And that was what really got me interested, and was also kind of my first taste of kind of the non-denominational approach to martial arts, in the sense of, hey, if you've got good information and you're among friends and you share that information, you don't have to have a rigid structure to present that stuff. And that's what really hooked me. So that school lasted probably about 2.5 years or so. I trained there, and 2 to 2.5 years. And then our head instructor, he was going for his master's degree. So he basically, by that time, I had got my black belt in ASP, had a couple of other black belts, and he said, what we're going to do is migrate our classes to the YMCA. So he had cut a deal with a local YMCA to be able to host our classes and everything. And he basically kind of stepped away from teaching. We took over the teaching side, and we continued to share ASP with people through the YMCA classes. So the commercial school closed down, and we basically kind of migrated there. But I ended up training ASP through about 4 years through my entire high school.
Okay. Wow. That's the other thing that kind of surprised when you mentioned the high school had a martial art. I mean, I've heard that at so many colleges having a martial arts club. I don't think I've ever heard that at a high school before. That's really cool. That's another thing that's kind of ahead of their time, I think, back then.
I think it was, yeah. And a lot of it was because, again, this instructor, he was a pretty assertive guy, pretty forward-thinking guy, and he, convinced the school to allow him to do that. And, I ended up transferring to a different high school partway through the high school period.
Okay.
So kind of lost access to the club, but still continued to train at the YMCA and, stayed active with that same training group.
Nice. And then talk a little bit about, you mentioned getting your black belt. What was that test like? I've talked to people with other specific styles, but in a more open style like that, kind of what was that test like? What kind of experience was that?
So ASP was basically Evan S. Baltazzi. He was, for his time, was a non-Asian guy who had achieved, pretty good credentials in traditional Asian martial arts. Mm-hmm. So he was like I think a fifth dan in Aikido. He was like a fifth or sixth dan in Judo. He had studied boxing. He had studied Savate. So he had a really good grounding in the martial arts. And what he wanted to do was to get away from kind of the traditional dogma of Asian martial arts. Interestingly, what he did was he recreated that dogma as an American martial art.
Okay.
So what you had was still a progression of belt ranks. So you would start off as a white belt, and then red belt, and then 5 degrees of red belt, and then brown belt, and then 3 degrees of brown belt, and then into black belt.
Okay.
So you basically, for each one of these ranks, you had, a specific series of techniques that you had to learn, contextual self-defense techniques. And then you also they didn't really do too much as far as forms. The forms were very, very simple, very straightforward, but we had required forms as well.
Okay.
Primary weapon that we used was a walking stick. So it was basically kind of a 3-foot straight stick. So kind of a blend of Aikido Jo technique and French Lacan.
Okay.
So you had kind of parallel requirements that went along with that. And then there was also one of the most interesting parts. There was an entire series of what were called psychosomatic exercises. And it was essentially stuff that he had drawn from primarily yoga. So you had various yoga poses and stuff that we had to learn, breathing techniques, meditation techniques, and things of that nature. Wow. So it was also kind of the psychosomatic aspect of that. But it was, a progression where each belt rank had a specific series of learning objectives that you had to go through. And then we did sparring. So there was sparring requirements. There were self-defense requirements where you basically be kind of we called it monkey in the middle. You were in the center of the group, and you'd have multiple attackers coming at you, and you basically have to spontaneously apply all of the techniques that you learn. So in addition to, hey, do technique, whatever specified technique it might be, lapel grab, single lapel grab and punch. In addition to doing that stuff kind of on command, you also had to be able to demonstrate your ability to do that spontaneously in kind of a simulated multiple attacker scenario.
Wow. About how long did the test last, probably?
I would say it was probably 2.5 to 3 hours total.
Wow. And what do you think drew you to the teaching side of that? I mean, had you started teaching before it moved to the YMCA and you kind of took over helping teach, or were you teaching before that as an assistant, or were you just kind of thrown into it?
Everybody, one of the cool things, again, about the group that we had, the senior instructors, we had some pretty good teachers there. I had seen some examples of bad teaching, and one of the things you'll find sometimes when, like in the traditional Asian martial arts, when you take something that is appropriate within Japanese culture, for example, where you have a very strict hierarchy of rank and everything, and then you take that and you apply that to America, sometimes what it does is it gives instructors the excuse to not have to explain things or answer questions because their authority gives them an out. the instructors that we had at ASP, we were free to ask questions. And if you didn't understand something, you'd ask a question. They would explain it. Sometimes what would happen is you'd have another instructor who'd be like, hey, I found that if I explain it this way, people understand it better. So you'd have instructors kind of helping each other out. And that example set kind of a strong standard for me early on as far as what to appreciate in a good martial arts instructor. Mm-hmm. And then when we would have new students come in, they were basically, kind of grooming us. We didn't necessarily realize it at the time, but, if I was a 5th degree red belt or whatever it is, and they have a new white belt that comes in, it might be something where it's like, hey, Mike, would you work with this guy and teach him this? And it frees up the instructor and the rest of the class to be able to do whatever was on the docket for that night as far as the curriculum. Okay. And in the process, I start to learn my teaching chops by helping out some of the junior students and giving them, essentially learning the ropes as far as how to teach. Yeah. And I found that I enjoyed it. And again, I wasn't able to quantify it at the time, but the example that they set as far as the quality of teaching and their willingness to answer questions was, I learned later on, unique in the martial arts world.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm assuming with that style that you were training in, they didn't really do competition. It wasn't that type of martial art.
It did have that element. We really didn't do that much. It was more of the idea of, we would spar. So we had, there was a kickboxing element to it, and we would do that. And there was a tournament structure that they could, ASP was not a widespread martial art. So it was kind of concentrated in the Chicago area. There was some clubs down in Southern Illinois. There was some clubs in, I think, Ohio and Pennsylvania, but they never really got organized well enough to create kind of a tournament environment.
Okay. And you mentioned that not widespread. I was just looking on their website, and I only see right now one school, and that's in Cleveland.
Yeah. I know that they had a fairly strong presence in Ohio. It was always a Midwest thing, and it really has not survived well, I guess, over the years.
That's too bad.
Yeah. I mean, it's, again, for me, it was a great place to start. Yeah. I look back on it now and realize that, there were a lot of things about it that could have been done better, but, in retrospect, it was a really good place to start. And I think just what ended up happening was, as other martial arts kind of took more of a public eye, where people would see, hey, I'm familiar with this, ASP just kind of took a back seat to a lot of that stuff because it just wasn't well known.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you said you were there about 4 years, so all through high school. So what was next for you? What was next in the journey?
So I joined the Army. I was on the late entry program. So I actually joined when I was still in high school. Okay. And then a month after graduated from high school, I was 17 years old, went off to basic training, and basically joined the Army to become a Chinese Mandarin linguist. So I went to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California to study Chinese. And basically, if you go to just about any military post, you'll find they'll have a gym, and there's usually somebody there working out, doing something, as far as martial arts and stuff like that. So you'll run into people, and it's like, hey, man, you want to get together and you want to spar, you want to hold pads for each other, you want, what do you do? And you get kind of this informal exchange of information, and you just find different training partners. So through my time at DLI, the first time, I actually went through DLI twice, but when I was there the first time, met a good friend of mine, Steve Whittle. Steve was actually one of the stable mates of Dan Anderson.
So Dan was
Super Dan Anderson. So he was part of the Oregon Karate Association, and Steve had trained there for many years, got his black belt there, and was very, very, very good tournament competitor. So he basically shared some of the Wu Ying Tao stuff with me. And he also had a background. He's also a black belt in Taekwondo, so helped me tune up my kicking skills even further. And Steve and I worked out a bunch when we were at DLI, so I got to pick his brain on a lot of different things, and just kind of continued my education. We ran into some other folks there that, had various backgrounds in martial arts. Knew a guy there who did Sikaran, so Filipino kicking style. So picking up little bits and pieces of stuff, and again, kind of continuing what I had done with my instructors at ASP, where we kind of got to cherry pick things from people who were, open-minded and free to share their experiences and the stuff that they liked most about the systems that they had learned. And that process kind of continued throughout my military career. So I was in the Army for 9 years, everywhere that I was stationed. Got a chance to basically kind of connect with some good people who were like, hey, you want to train? Sure. What do you want to do? Well, I do this. I do this. Okay, cool. Well, teach me this. Okay. In return, you teach me that. So it was a really great way of kind of becoming, I call it bastard son of many fathers. That approach to martial arts where you just get to cherry pick a lot of good stuff from people who are just willing to share, and you're not restricted by a rigid structure.
So if you had to guess over those 9 years, how many different styles do you think you got to sample, whether it was a one-time thing or long-term for a few months or something?
My strongest, most consistent training partners, it was Steve Whittle.
Okay.
And, the Wing Tao and Taekwondo stuff, again, cherry picking the stuff that was most attractive to me from that. And then when I was stationed at NSA, so National Security Agency at Fort Meade, I had a guy there named Dave Mears. Dave had been stationed in Germany, and he had studied Wing Chun under Leung Ting.
Nice.
So very good Wing Chun player. So sparred with him a bunch, got to pick up some Wing Chun. Again, not in a traditional sense, didn't learn forms, we didn't have a wooden dummy or anything of that nature. It was more just the idea of, the skill-based stuff that was more of a dynamic application than it was a traditional, regimented form. And then worked out with people, again, who had just different backgrounds, worked out with some Kempo guys. The Kempo stuff really didn't get into kind of the program technique of it. It was more kind of conceptually based, some of the stuff that they, do uniquely well. Yeah, those are probably the strongest influences I had.
Very cool. Okay. And then after the 9 years in the military, what was next?
So toward the end, I had gone back to DLI for Vietnamese, became a Vietnamese linguist, and then was stationed in Hawaii. And one of the things that had always fascinated me, going back to my ASP days, one of the things that scared me most was the idea of somebody attacking me with a knife. Mm-hmm. And the knife techniques, counter knife techniques that existed in ASP, I didn't think were very practical. Okay. So I had gone to my instructor and I said, hey, I don't really have a whole lot of faith in these techniques, but this is something that really concerns me. Can we learn better counter knife stuff? And he gave me some wisdom that I take with me to this day. If you want to learn how to defend against a weapon, you have to learn how to use the weapon. Because that's the only way you can understand its capabilities. Yep. So I said, okay, well, let's do knife. So he was a former Army Ranger. He taught us what little he knew of military-style knife fighting. And then one of my training partners, Mark Reffner, he was an older guy. He was a few years older than me. Gave me a copy of Rex Applegate's Kill or Get Killed. And he's like, hey, there's some knife stuff in here. You might want to check this out. And he's like, also check out this magazine, Soldier of Fortune magazine. And looked at that. Soldier of Fortune had just come out. This is mid-1970s. And David Steele was writing what he called Steele on Knives, his column in Soldier of Fortune. Yeah. And started reading that, getting into all of that type of stuff. And that's where I first heard about the Filipino martial arts. Okay. So when I became a Vietnamese linguist, I was stationed in Hawaii at Field Station Kunia in Hawaii. And it's like, okay, so here I am, large Filipino population here in Hawaii. I want to learn Filipino martial arts because all the research I've done, this is going to be some great stuff. So I reached out to the Filipino Chamber of Commerce in Waipahu. And I said, hey, I'm a U.S. serviceman stationed here in Hawaii. Could you please give me some names of Filipino martial arts instructors in Hawaii so I can seek out some instruction? They gave me a list of names. I started making phone calls. And basically the response I got was, hey, what's your name? Mike Janich. You're not Filipino. Click.
Oh, wow.
So they were not really open to sharing their art outside of their ethnic community. Mm-hmm. One instructor who was an exception to that was Raymond Tabosa. So Raymond Tabosa, he accepted me as a student. I told him that I was very interested in learning knife. And he's like, I'll teach you stick. It's like, okay. So I got my basics in Tabosa Eskrima, kind of my start in the Filipino martial arts, working with him. And then my schedule changed with my military job and everything. I was no longer able to pursue that, but I continued to practice that, continued to explore that. And right around that time was when Dan Inocento's book, Filipino Martial Arts, had come out. You were starting to get a little bit of information about the Filipino arts. And I really kind of focused a lot of my research on that. And got out of the Army, ended up going to work as a intelligence officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency, working out of Hong Kong.
Oh,
So I
wow.
was stationed at the consulate in Hong Kong. My wife and I moved there, and again, connected with a few people in the consulate there who did martial arts. Some of the Marine security guard guys did martial arts, so I did a little bit of training with them. But my real focus was, hey, I want to try to learn the Filipino martial arts. And there was very little stuff out there formally at that time. So it wasn't the, books and videos and everything that you find now. But one of the things that I had done in my military career was I got certified as an intelligence analyst by NSA. So I was pretty good at the analytical side of things. And I just started looking at the Filipino arts based on what I had read and learned, was that all of the angles and basic tactics are the same. You simply adapt them to the attributes of the weapon.
Right.
So I started looking at all the stick stuff, which was kind of the open source available stuff, and adapting that to what I believed was appropriate knife technique. So really started to develop what became the roots of martial blade concepts back then, and really focusing on the use of knives. And one of the motivating factors for that, my job in Hong Kong, I was, as an intelligence officer, I was basically debriefing Vietnamese refugees who claimed to have information about American POWs and MIAs in Vietnam, or incidents involving POWs and MIAs. There were about 65,000 Vietnamese refugees in Hong Kong, spread among 17 camps. I was also responsible for the Philippines, where there was about another 30,000 Vietnamese refugees down there. I was traveling solo this entire time, so I would go into these camps, and many of the camps in Hong Kong were actually populated by former North Vietnamese gang members. So when Vietnam decided to purge many of their criminals, basically what they did was they pushed them into the refugee stream, and they ended up in Hong Kong. So they had no legitimate claim to refugee status, and they were basically stuck in the Hong Kong camps, where they continued to run their gang activities. And there was definitely, like any other detention center, any other prison, there were shanks and weapons and everything throughout the camp. So I was looking at, okay, how do I keep myself safe in this environment? What kind of weapon can I carry? Even though I was assigned to the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong, I couldn't own a gun. I certainly couldn't carry a gun. So the knife was something that really became kind of a go-to choice for me.
Okay.
And really that fueled a lot of my interest in developing good knife tactics. So I worked for DIA for about 2 years, and then I accepted a position at the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok with another organization that was working on POWMIA, the resolution of the POWMIA issue. Yeah. That was Joint Casualty Resolution Center. So I became a team leader for them, leading investigation teams into Vietnam. Later, I worked in Laos as well. And again, we were forbidden from carrying purpose-designed weapons, but pocket knives, would fly under the radar. So as far as all of my travel throughout Southeast Asia, I had a diplomatic passport back then, which was great. Also in Thailand, had a get out of jail free card, which was nice. But basically carried a knife on a regular basis and really focused heavily on developing my skills with a knife, because that was my primary defensive weapon if I was faced with something that, warranted lethal force.
Wow. I mean, just what an amazing life. So, I mean, I want to see the movie.
Yeah.
It's so cool. So
it'll probably be a cartoon, but that's okay.
Hey, I'll still watch it. So then for you, what came first for you? Did you start your program? Did you the martial blade concepts? Did you start designing knives first? Which of those came first?
What really came first was trying to understand knives as weapons.
Okay.
And one of the interesting things, again, going back to what was available, like in the 70s, really between kind of World War II and the mid-1970s, there was really nothing that came out as far as knife fighting or knife tactics or anything of that nature. And then David Steele's book came out. There were a number of other books that came out during that time. And looking at those and then looking at historical texts and stuff like that, trying to figure out how edge weapons work, how they were used historically, different attributes of edge weapons and stuff like that, and then try to apply that to something that I could actually carry on a daily basis. Because, you go back to fighting with a Bowie knife or fighting with a stiletto or something of that nature that was appropriate at a particular time in history, but it didn't translate well to modern times. So really focusing on, small concealable knives and the mechanics of how those would work, and then how they would lend themselves to basically what I was kind of trying to recreate forensically, which was Filipino style knife fighting.
Okay.
So that was, kind of understanding the weapon, then understanding the tactics that would go along with it, trying to put those things together, and then that they were mutually beneficial. So it became kind of a parallel process of understanding the tool, understanding the tactics, and making sure the two supported each other.
Okay. Wow. I was just looking through your website, and you even have a distance learning program, which is kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
So is that something if someone subscribes to that, it's just monthly videos? There's so many videos a month where they do training with, or is that live sessions? Is it a mixture of both?
So if we fast forward a bit,
mm-hmm.
back in, I guess it was 1991, I was working at the American Embassy in Bangkok.
Okay.
And one of the guys that I worked with there was a guy named Jim Webb. So Jim
Yes.
was a warrant officer in the Army, Vietnamese linguist, also Korean linguist. And he had previously been attached to first group of U.S. Special Forces.
Okay.
So he had a martial arts background, a strong martial arts background, and he had, way back in the day, I don't know if you remember Panther Productions.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so the Panther, if you go back to the old martial arts magazines, 6-page ad, 8-page ad of all these different stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he had done basically a Special Forces combatives series of videos.
Yes.
When he was with First Group, it was leading up to the 1988 Seoul Olympics, and he convinced the commander of First Group to basically let him bring in named martial artists, and they were trying to create a combative system that was unique to First Group.
Oh, wow.
And this was basically, they were going to be kind of the U.S. contingent as far as, special operations and counterterrorism for
mm-hmm.
the Seoul Olympics. And the South Koreans had developed, I believe it was called Black Tiger or something like that. They had their own combative system. He wanted to have a parallel system.
Okay.
So he, again, had cherry-picked a bunch of stuff from some, very highly regarded martial artists that they brought in there. And he ended up creating this series of videos for Panther. He gave me a copy of those videos when I was in Hong Kong, and I watched the videos, and the knife fighting stuff was terrible.
Okay.
When we ended up working together, he said to me, hey, what do you think of my videos? And I said, not bad, but the knife fighting stuff sucks. And he was kind of, taken aback by that. And he was like, well, show me something better. So I showed him basically what became the rudiments of MBC back then, Martial Blade Concepts.
Okay.
And he's like, wow, this is really good. We should do some videos with Panther. So
okay.
we made arrangements, ended up flying from Bangkok to LA, shot 4 videos for Panther. Those came out. That was the first time that I had done any martial arts videos. Fast forward some more. 1994, I went to work for Paladin Press, and I basically stood up their video production department.
Okay.
And in the process, I was the first person, and actually the only person really with Paladin, who went from being a customer to an author to an employee. And basically, while I was an employee, I was also still an author. So my Fighting Folders series,
mm-hmm.
Fighting Folders, Advanced Fighting Folders, Mastering Fighting Folders, Mastering the Balisong, a number of videos. I produced those all when I was with Paladin as an author, and I was also the videographer and editor for all of that stuff. What I found was that with any video, once you make a video and you edit it, it's frozen in time.
Yeah.
Unless you purposely go back and edit it. This from your audio work.
Oh, yeah.
Unless you purposely go back in there and you dig deep and you decide to do the work all over again, trying to change something, after the fact is really difficult.
Yes.
And especially once you've released something commercially, it's very much frozen in time.
Yeah.
So the distance learning program is a very long way of kind of getting to the point of, with the distance learning program, the most recent series of full-length instructional videos I did was a 6-volume set with my former business partner in a company called Stay Safe Media. MBC is a living, evolving system. One of the things that I believe in is that we have to continue to be students. We have to continue to learn. We can't get stuck in our own dogma and stop evolving. So on the positive side, NBC has evolved tremendously over the past 20 years. On the negative side, the videos that I made 20 years ago are now obsolete.
Right.
So the distance learning program initially became kind of a way of supplementing some of the stuff that was in the video. So those were the foundation. It's like, okay, learn this stuff. If you have a detailed question on a particular topic, that lesson became complementary material. So it became a supplement to the main videos.
Okay.
Well, as the system continued to evolve and those videos became more and more obsolete, the distance learning program basically supplanted that, kind of replaced it. And it now is kind of the living library that is the most up-to-date reference of what the MBC system and the counterblade concept system, the empty hand defense against knife system that I teach.
Wow.
It really is that. And also what it gives us is, I'm a big proponent of when something changes, you don't sweep it under the rug and say, okay, we never did that before. We've always done it this way.
Yeah.
I don't like revisionist history. So one of the things that I do with the distance learning program is I also will archive materials. So let's say that I did a technique a particular way, and it's like, okay, this is the state of the art right now. A year from now, I figure out a better way to do that, something that is easier to learn, perhaps easier to apply. Maybe it's easier for people of smaller stature to be able to apply against people who are larger. And it's like, okay, this is now our revised state of the art. I acknowledge the fact, hey, we used to do this way. Now we do it this way. We do it this way for these reasons. These are the tangible advantages of the new method. And then I archive the old lesson. So the old lesson is still available. So you can go back and say, oh, okay, this is what they used to do. Now this is what okay, I see the difference. And there's always that basis for comparison. And also it becomes the living history so people understand how the system continues to evolve.
That's cool. That's actually a really good way to do it. And I'm assuming it's been, people are enjoying it and getting a lot of positive feedback about it.
We'll be starting our 13th year of the distance learning program. Currently there's over 95 hours of content.
Wow. Can you tell, I don't know what type of research you do on like who's using it, but is there a mixture of like traditional martial artists that are using this to add into what they're currently doing versus just people who just want to learn, the knife stuff and don't have a martial arts background?
It's a little bit of everything. So, I've actually done some demographic surveys trying to figure out who my audience is. In many cases, what you'll get are people who have done traditional martial arts and then kind of got disillusioned with what they were doing.
Okay.
And then they see something that is a little bit more progressive. They start to look into NBC. And then they realize, hey, this is something that appeals to me more. I teach seminars across the country, used to teach internationally as well, but haven't done that in a few years.
Mm-hmm.
So in some cases, you'll have people who are curious. They'll come to a seminar. They'll be exposed to NBC and say, wow, I really like this. I want to do more of it. They'll sign up for the distance learning program. Certainly when I was doing the Best Defense TV show, that was an excellent marketing platform.
Oh, yeah.
To be able to reach a broad audience of people. So whenever I was able to highlight NBC and CBC in that context, that was something that really gave me a broad reach as far as finding people who are interested in learning more. And in many cases, I've had people who are like, I watched The Best Defense and I was just really liked your teaching style. When I did some research, I saw this distance learning program, signed up for it, and I love it.
Nice.
So you'll have some people who are experienced martial artists. You'll have other people who are, always wanted to do something but couldn't find the right fit, and then feel that they found it with NBC.
Okay. You mentioned the TV show. Talk about that. How did that come about?
So Michael Bain is an amazing guy, had really amazing personal history as far as what he had done. But he had a show called Shooting Gallery.
Mm-hmm.
So Shooting Gallery ran for 20 years on Outdoor Channel. And it was all aspects of shooting, competitive shooting, defensive shooting, firearms history, all kinds of stuff. And when that show first came on the air, I've been writing for magazines, various magazines since 1992, and was writing for what was back then Harris Publications. And this was leading up actually to Y2K. So everyone's waiting for the world to end and, civilization to collapse and everything. And they reached out to me and said, hey, would you be interested in writing some articles for our Y2K special? Sure. Michael Bain was the editor for that special. They had hired him for a series of specials during 1999 leading up to 2000. So I proposed some articles, wrote the articles, submitted those with the photos, and corresponded back and forth with Michael Bain. He's like, hey, I really like this. This is good writing. The photos are clear. Awesome. This stuff is good to go. So we developed good rapport during that time. he found out that I lived here in Colorado, and he's like, hey, I live here in Colorado as well. And I told him back then I had just started teaching for Spyderco. So the Spyderco Knife Company, basically Sal Glesser, the founder of the company, he found out about my approach to knife self-defense, and with a recommendation from James Keating and some other folks, Sal was like, we'd like to have you teach your system for us, is what we call our Martial Blade Craft program. So he coined the term Martial Blade Craft, and started teaching those seminars. I mentioned that to Michael Bain, and he's like, I've carried a knife for years. I've never had any formal training in how to use it. He was a black belt in Tang Soo Do, I believe.
Okay.
And he's like, can I take one of these classes? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. So made arrangements for him to join one of the seminars. He jumped in, did a weekend of NBC training. And at the end of it, he's like, you're a really good instructor. I really like the way you present stuff. It's, it's clear, it's concise. This is good stuff. Fast forward a few months, he starts doing shooting gallery and calls me up, and he's like, hey, I'm looking for a brief segment on the, shooting gallery. I want to talk about stuff that happens at really, really close range. And I'm like, okay, I can do that. I could talk about weapon access at close range, talk about, empty hand threat mitigation, transition to what we call earning your draw. We can talk about that stuff. So he came out with his videographer. I grabbed one of my students, and we shot a 5-minute segment. At the end of the 5-minute segment, he's like, that was really good. Can we shoot a few more minutes? I'm like, okay, sure. Let's address this. So we shot a few more minutes. He's like, okay, that was great. He calls me up the next day, and he's like, I'd like to do the full half hour on you and just have you do some more stuff, because we looked at the stuff last night and it's really good. Okay, we can do that. So he came back out. We shot the balance of that show. And that show aired, had really good response to it. The following season, he invited me back. We did another show. Following season, did the same thing. Following season, did the same thing. So I did 4 dedicated shows on shooting gallery.
Okay.
And when he came up with the idea for the best defense, he proposed that to the Outdoor Channel. And they're like, yeah, this sounds like a great idea. Who do you want for your co-hosts and subject matter experts? And he's like, well, let's go back through the ratings for shooting gallery and figure out who generated the most positive response. And the 4 shows that I had done were among the highest rated that he had for shooting gallery. Nice. As far as anything related to self-defense. So he reached out to me and he said, hey, would you be interested in being one of the co-hosts and subject matter experts for the show? And I'm like, yeah, that sounds great. So I was awesome. Involved from the very start, from the genesis of the show for the entire 11 season run.
That is so cool. And looking at your website, I'm looking at, some like the custom knives you've designed and stuff. And I think I read you've done well over 20. Is that something you're still doing? Cause I know like Spyderco has, or not Spyderco, 5x5 Combat Solutions. They carry the Spyderco knives that you designed. A lot of them are back ordered and sold out. So are you still doing that? Are you coming up with new stuff, or?
So there's kind of 2 different things there. So for Spyderco, I'm actually a full-time Spyderco employee. That's my day job.
Oh, okay.
So I am the basically senior technical writer for Spyderco. So I write their entire catalog. I write all of their catalog supplements. I write every one of the products comes with a product information guide that traces the history of the evolution of the product. I write all of that. Wow. I write their what used to be their newsletter, their e-newsletter, now is a blog. So I do all the blog writing for that as well. So basically any kind of technical writing for them. Mm-hmm. I designed my first knives for Spyderco back when I was teaching the Martial Blade Craft program for them back around 2000. And got to know Sal Glesser, designed a couple of knives for him back then. And then fast forward to 2009 when I became an employee for Spyderco, and Sal asked me to design some more stuff. So I ended up designing kind of second generation stuff, the Yojimbo 2, the Ronin 2, the Yojimbo 2, then inspired a larger version called the Yojimbo, smaller version called the Micro Jimbo. Mm-hmm. So I have a number of different products. I also sold them a U.S. patent that I had done for a knife called the Janich, which is my take on a Filipino balisong, kind of a product improved version of that. So all of those products are still active and valid products for Spyderco, and they're sold through Spyderco's distribution channels. So they sell to distributors, they sell to dealers worldwide, they sell retail. So all those knives are available. 5x5, a friend of mine, Mark Olson, the very first knife that I designed was the Tempest for the Masters of Defense Knife Company back when I was still working for Paladin, and Mark Olson was part of Masters of Defense back then. So we've been friends for over 20 years. 5x5 makes accessories for Spyderco knives.
Oh,
so they
okay.
make like wave attachments, deep pocket carry clips, and other things like that. And I started doing some custom grinding of different Spyderco knives. It's like one of the things I believe in. I grew up Chicago area. Chicago has very strict blade length limitations for carrying a pocket knife, 2.5 inches. My daughter went to college out in Boston. Boston also 2.5 inch blade. So what I started doing was I took my full size carry knives. I took basically a duplicate one, and I ground it down to 2.5 inches. So when I'm in Colorado, I carry the normal version. If I had to go back and visit family in Chicago or go see my daughter in Boston, I would carry the shortened version.
Okay.
So I still had the same length handle. I still had all the muscle memory and everything that went along with it, but I had a legally compliant blade. When some of my students found out about that, especially the ones that work in U.S. federal buildings, where it's also a 2.5 inch blade length limit for a government employee, they're like, hey, can you do that for me as well? Sure. So I started custom grinding knives, basically making snub nose versions of production knives that were legally compliant for areas that had really strict blade length limitations.
Mm-hmm.
So that is what 5x5 sells. So I don't run a commercial store on my website or anything of that nature.
Yeah.
And I want to support Mark. Mark's been a friend for a long time. So I said, hey, if you're selling stuff retail, how about if you become the exclusive source for my custom ground knives? So that way I don't have to worry about all the order fulfillment and stuff like that. So if something is out of stock, what that means is that Mark has not reached out to me and said, hey, I need more of these.
Okay.
So that's on him.
So keep checking back, and they'll be there again. So
yeah, and it's one of those things where, again, if you're looking for something in particular, email him and say, hey, I'm looking for this thing. Put me on a waiting list,
okay.
Or get an order in with Mike, because I basically, I don't grind it to order necessarily, but I grind that in small batches because that's very much a sideline thing for me. But I like to support Mark and
nice.
All of the custom stuff that I do. I do a shortened version of the Ojimbo called the Chicago Jimbo. I do a shortened version of the Delica called a Jandelica, a Janich Delica, a Jandura, which is shortened Endura. So I do a number of different snub nose versions of knives for him to meet specific blade length limitations.
Nice. Yeah, I've been looking through it. I'll probably be ordering one or two of these. There's some nice ones on here. So very cool. So other thing I wanted to ask you, I've noticed, all the books you've written, but most of them are technique stuff and things like that. Any chance of you writing a biography? Because like I said, amazing story. I'd love to read the in-depth version of that.
You've gotten the highlights. Just take notes. I mean, people have asked about that before. I honestly don't know that there would be enough there to make it really interesting reading. I've had some great opportunities throughout my life. I've always tried to embrace the opportunities that presented themselves, and have been fortunate to either have some things land in my lap, or in some cases I kind of created the opportunities and ended up applying for jobs that didn't exist and getting them.
That's cool.
So that assertiveness has gotten me some really good stuff. But one of the things that I should have done is kept a journal along the way, so that I could have better documented the events as they happened. Trying to go back and recreate all that stuff now would be a lot of work to create a book that I don't know would be of interest to that many people.
I'm in the same boat. I'm trying to write my first book, and same thing. It's like, I think this is how I remembered. Man, why didn't I keep a journal? So, same thing. So to all my listeners, especially the young ones, start keeping a journal.
Yeah. I mean, even if it's, the great thing is with, technology these days, that's something that you can do where it's like, you grab an audio recorder or something like that. And, you just, okay, hey, today these highlights, bang, here it is, and then same thing with photos. Okay, I took some photos of this stuff and I'm going to archive this. And you basically create, a multimedia journal that allows you to really document stuff very easily. And now with AI and everything else, it's like, okay, take this and summarize it and
turn it into a PDF. Yep.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So throughout your martial arts career, your journey, your military, everything, is there one philosophy that you've either learned from someone else or developed on your own that's just super important, that's at the top of your list?
Probably the one that is most important, and it's also the one that resonates best, I think, with my students once they start to get into martial blade concepts, counter blade concepts, any of the systems that I teach, have a plan and work your plan. And basically what that means is you want to create a plan that is as thorough and as bulletproof as it can possibly be, and then practice and learn to implement that well. And in the process, explore how, when things go south, you can continue the plan and still achieve acceptable results.
I like it.
So one of the things that you'll find sometimes, like, I have a good friend who did Kempo karate for a long time. And when you look at Kempo, it is an encyclopedia of martial arts movement.
Yes.
But it's also a very challenging exercise in memorization. So you're trying to memorize all these different techniques. You're trying to learn to execute these things. And what it comes down to is you basically have a system that to use reflexively and to use spontaneously is really difficult because, when you go back to the idea of the OODA loop and everything, observe, orient, decide, act, Hicks law, all the kind of stuff that you'll hear quoted all the time. Basically what it comes down to is the more choices you have, the slower your decision-making process.
Right.
So when you are overwhelmed with just this vast amount of choices, should I do this technique? Should I do this? Should I do this? And when the stimulus for the technique is so finely determined in the sense of, okay, is this a single hand choke or a one hand lapel grab? Is this a two hand choke or a two hand lapel grab? If you have different responses for every one of those possibilities, it's like, okay, I'm trying to remember too much stuff and I'm not able to respond with something that is simple, straightforward, and as multi-purpose and non-diagnostic as possible.
Nice.
So being able to take something and say, you know what? I'm going to develop a plan, and then constantly go back and critique as you challenge yourself. You say, okay, here's my response to this type of attack. Okay, somebody's going to throw a roundhouse punch, try to hit me in the head. Here's my response. Okay, well, what if instead of a roundhouse punch, that was an overhand cross instead? Could I still make this work? What if instead of a roundhouse punch, he's swinging a bottle at my head? What if it's a tire iron? What if it's a hammer or a stick or a longer weapon? What if he's holding a baseball bat with two hands, but he's swinging on the same angle? Can I make the same thing work for all of those things and essentially have, as much as possible, a one-size-fits-all response? Right. So I have a very generic but still well enough defined stimulus that triggers as close as possible to a universal response.
I like that a lot. All right. How about over your career, a worst martial arts related injury? Have you been lucky or have you had some bad ones?
Probably the worst one that I had, I was studying Filipino martial arts after I moved here to Colorado. So I was working with a guy named Bill Kipp, really good guy. Bill was a former Force Recon Marine stationed in the Philippines and then got out, lived in the Philippines for a couple of years, learned Balintawak Arnis, and then came back here, became associated with the Remy Presas family and everything, and basically taught loosely modern Arnis, but it was really more traditional Balintawak from the Philippines. And we were doing stick disarms. And the disarm was basically kind of wrapping your arm over, you hold onto the stick, wrap your elbow over the top of the hand, and then strip the stick. And my partner got the distance entirely wrong, and he grabbed my wrist and wrapped his arm over my elbow and basically hyperextended my elbow pretty severely. So my right arm was pretty much screwed for about 2.5 months.
So did you get pretty good with your left arm then during that time, or did you take it easy?
What do they say? Necessity of the mother?
Yep.
No, necessity is the mother of invention. That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
But definitely forces you to change gears. And then I've had both my knees scoped for a torn meniscus. And that was kind of cumulative, just a lifetime of training martial arts. And especially back in the old days, you got to kick so that your gi pops. Okay.
Yep.
My gi popped and my knees popped along with it. And, it took its toll. So again, during that time, being in a brace and on crutches for a while, you learn to change gears and adapt. And you learn to lower your response threshold during that time because your physical attributes are diminished.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So being that, your space is more in like, the real world self-defense and knives and things. What are your thoughts on something like MMA and the UFC? Is that something you're a fan of?
MMA and UFC, I love it. Especially, I loved it during the early days.
Me too.
When it was like, no weight categories, basically bare knuckle, and you had a lot of the style versus style type of stuff. I thought that was kind of the coolest thing ever, because it was always one of those things that was, reading any martial arts magazine during the 70s and 80s. And it's like, okay, can Taekwondo beat Capoeira? It's like, it was always those, rhetorical questions. And I really loved it during that time. What MMA has become these days, I mean, the guys who do it are incredible athletes. I have tremendous respect for them within the scope of that discipline.
Yeah.
They're incredibly tough. They're incredibly well-versed as far as, striking, grappling, everything else. But one of the things that often happens is people will look at that and say, well, this is totality. This is total combat. And it's like, no, it's not, because they still have rules.
Yeah.
And again, with all due credit to them for, the incredible athletes that they are, if you want to develop a good self-defense system, what you do is you look at the UFC and you say, okay, what's all the stuff that's illegal? Okay, here's a list of what's illegal. This is the top of my list for self-defense.
Yep.
And that it should be the most brutal, vicious stuff that you can use with the least amount of physical attributes necessary.
Yeah.
And that's where there's a huge misconception. And I think that is also kind of, by extension, kind of applied to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So again, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, incredibly, incredibly talented people, an incredible breadth of physical discipline as far as, the scope of that system. But what's interesting is you'll see stuff where it's like, well, this is BJJ self-defense. And it's like, well, BJJ self-defense ought to be Japanese karate, or Japanese Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah.
And it's like, what does that mean? When I say that to people, it's like, well, BJJ was basically derived from original Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, which was a complete system that included small joint manipulation and atemi, striking. So it was a complete system. And then what happened was it was basically made into more of a sport form. And small joint manipulation was taken out, striking was taken out, and you now have a very sophisticated, systematic approach to grappling that is phenomenal. But it is not a basis for self-defense. And it's also one of those things where, because you're good at grappling, the old saying, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. So just because you are good at grappling doesn't mean that grappling is the best tactic for all self-defense contexts.
Yeah.
So the idea of wrapping somebody up and getting into some type of, grappling finish for something, and you certainly have the ability with many BJJ techniques to create limb destruction, to create a decisive finish.
Oh, yeah.
But what ends up happening is you fight the way you train. And if you constantly train to allow somebody to tap, you're conditioned to allow that to happen. And you're conditioned to apply, gradual pressure so you don't destroy things. And a lot of what is practiced in that system is perfectly appropriate in the sportive application of it. But when you try to take that and say, oh, this is now self-defense, I don't agree with that.
I love your outlook on that. That's really good. All right. I have a few fun questions we use to wrap up the interview. So we were just talking a little bit about MMA. So let's say at some point in your life, you decided you're going to step into that octagon. You're going to take that walk into the cage. What's your walk-up song going to be? What music's playing as you're taking that walk?
AC/DC, Highway to Hell.
I think you're my second guest in a row to say that. That's great. Minds think alike again. All right. Who are 3, 4, 5 names you'd put on your personal Mount Rushmore of martial arts?
Oh, wow. I guess you'd have to do Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, Jackie Chan, Kelly McCann.
Nice.
Don Draeger.
Ah, yes. Okay.
Robert W. Smith.
Nice.
Mark Hatmaker.
Okay.
Dan Inosanto.
Yeah.
Edgar Suilite.
Okay.
That's probably, you need a pretty big mountain for all that stuff.
Yeah, that's a pretty stacked Mount Rushmore. So, all right. How about, can't pick one that you wrote, a favorite martial arts book?
Filipino Martial Arts by Dan Inosanto.
Nice. Nice. I've never met Dan. I've interviewed his daughter and his son-in-law, both on the show, and I'm hoping to get Dan someday, but the guy's a legend. He'd be fun just to sit down and talk to, I think.
Yeah, a truly amazing martial artist, and still at it.
Yeah.
80 plus years old and still going strong. He's inspiration to us all.
Yep. All right. This one, you may or may not have an answer for. It's 50-50 with my guess, but do you have a favorite martial arts video game? Did you ever get into gaming?
I never got into gaming.
Okay.
So,
no worries.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. All right. How about a favorite martial arts TV show?
Ooh, TV show. Actually, so this is kind of obscure, but it was a TV show. So when I lived in Hawaii, they had local TV stations that were Japanese language TV stations, and they showed the Zatoichi series.
Nice.
So the blind swordsman. So that with subtitles was awesome.
That's cool. Yeah, I need to go back. I haven't watched that since I was a teenager. I need to go back and find that again, but that is so cool. I think you're probably my only third guest that's brought that one up. I'm actually shocked that one wasn't mentioned more. So, all right. How about a favorite martial arts movie?
I mean, Enter the Dragon is a classic. I mean, that one, I bought a VHS tape of Enter the Dragon when we got our first VCR. It was a top loading VCR. We got that in like 1977.
Nice.
And I bought a bootleg copy of Enter the Dragon and watched that thing to death.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Final question. Any movie you've seen in your whole life, doesn't have to be a martial arts movie, just a favorite movie fight scene.
Ooh, favorite fight scene.
And if you want to make it two-part, if you want to pick a regular fight scene and maybe one with knives, split it up if you want to.
I would say as far as knives, I believe it was Raid 2.
Oh, yes.
There was the kind of the extended karambit scene in that. I'm not a big karambit fan, but the choreography for that was awesome.
Yeah.
And I think that, I believe it was that same movie too, was also the hammer fight scene, the double hammers.
Oh, yes. Nice. That is cool. A lot of people pick the raid, but not those specific scenes. So I like that. That's cool. All right. Before I let you go, Michael, anything I forgot to ask you, or we want to be sure to get out there? And like I said, when the episode comes out, I will put links for everything you want me to, and your books and your website and everything else. But any last minute stuff we want to get out there before we wrap it up?
I guess probably the main thing, this is how I end all of my seminars, is that, for people who are interested in self-defense, you can train martial arts for a lot of different reasons. And we talked about some of those reasons, during our conversation here. Whatever you do, if you want to train in the martial arts, that's awesome. I mean, it's a tremendous discipline. It's a tremendous body of knowledge. It's a great physical culture. What I recommend that people do is two things. One is define your goals. So figure out, if you're interested in self-defense, then when you walk into a martial arts school and they say, yeah, we go to tournaments and we spar a lot, you're not in the right place. So you have to be able to define your goal. If that goal is, truly practical, usable self-defense, then make sure that you devote your time to studying something that's appropriate. And also remember that we live in America. And what I mean by that is, when you look at some of the negative aspects of traditional martial arts, again, when you look at the Japanese martial arts are awesome, and they're even more awesome in the context of Japanese culture. So when you look at those as an extension of Japanese culture, and you look at the way, the terms of respect and everything of that nature, it's all perfectly appropriate because it's all considered in the same context. When you take that outside of Japanese culture, what ends up happening, sometimes you'll have people who basically go on a power trip. And, it's like, I'm sensei, you can't ask me questions. Again, that may be something that is tolerable in Japanese culture, but it shouldn't fly in the US. And it's also one of those things where there is a huge amount of misinformation, especially when it comes to, like, if you look at a form, a kata or something like that, what is this movement for? You should know what you're doing at all times. If you're practicing something, if you're investing your time and effort into something, especially if your goal is to have some type of functional skill, then you should know what you're doing. It shouldn't be, oh, I move my arm like this, and hopefully later on they'll tell me what this means. If you don't know what it is, don't waste your time doing it. And very importantly, have a really good bullshit detector. So if somebody is teaching you a technique and you look at that and say, you know what? If I practice this diligently for a few hours, if I still don't have a high confidence level that I could make this work for real, it's not worth my time. I need to keep looking, and I need to find something that is more practical, and it's a better solution to the problem. And a lot of people get stuck in, they drink a particular art's Kool-Aid or a particular system's Kool-Aid, and it's like, okay, I'm buying into this because this is all I've got, and I've got to be totally invested. The operative term of self-defense is self. So what you need to do is think for yourself and learn to protect yourself. And that solution is always a little bit different for everybody.
Right.
So don't let the system become more important than what you're trying to get from it, and have an open mind. If you don't get what you need from a particular system, have the wisdom to move on and cultivate that personal toolbox that you need to keep yourself safe.
Nice. I love it. What a great way to end. Seriously, this has been so much fun. I mean, I love your story. I do hope you write that book someday, because I will be one of the first ones to buy it. You're such a great storyteller, and it's been a great conversation. I think my listeners are really going to love it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And, if you ever want to chat again, you know where to find me.
Wrap up today's episode by taking your own training to the next level with Martial Theory by Steve Perlman, the book that's redefining martial arts thinking. Find Martial Theory on Amazon today. Join the worldwide movement at martialtheoryu.com, where you'll find Q&A sessions, live events, and direct guidance from Steve himself. Use code EverydayMA for 20% off for life. That's martialtheoryu.com, code EverydayMA. Thanks for listening to Everyday Martial Artist. We hope you will join us every week for a brand new episode with a different martial artist telling their story. If you enjoy the show, be sure to leave us a review. Also, be sure to check out our website at everydaymartialartist.com. There you can find all of our episodes and contact us to suggest guests and ask questions. Again, thanks for listening to Everyday Martial Artist, and we'll see you next week.